Okay, reducing reverb. This is probably going to be the most daunting one, but we're going to go through it slowly, and I am confident that everyone here can nail it. So let's go ahead and take a listen to our track and our timeline here.
The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee.
Okay, so as you can hear, it is full of unwanted reverb. I recorded this in a bathroom. So we're going to grab our parametric equalizer, as many of you probably have already guessed. So we're going to grab our parametric equalizer and we're going to drag that into the track and go ahead and open that up. And we are likely going to be using all 5 of these points here at some point. So, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to adjust the width, and we want the width to be rather narrow because what we're going to end up doing is dragging them along the x-axis while they're raised really high up on the y-axis, and we're going to be looking for points where the audio starts to distort. And when we find those points, we're going to drag them down. You might be wondering, how will I know when I hear distorted audio? And I'm going to point it out, so rest assured, you will know. So
the grandmother
we'll take our
didn't
first
want
point
to
and
go
we'll
to
just kind of
Florida.
drag that along.
She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee and was
That's
seizing
something.
at every chance
All right.
to change
Yeah,
Bailey's
that's what
mind.
distortion sounds like. So we're going to go ahead and
Bailey was the son she
drop
lived with,
that
her
down.
only
And you're
boy.
not going to notice a huge
He
change
was sitting on the
immediately.
edge of
This
his
is going to
chair at the
be
table, bent over the
a marathon rather than a sprint. So now that we've got one point down, let's move on to our next point. And again, we're going to adjust that width, and we're going to take it, and we're going to raise it up and drag it along.
Now
the
look here, Bailey, she
x-axis.
said.
Ooh.
See here, read this. And she stood
That
with
might
one
be-
hand on her hip.
Ooh,
and
I
the
think we
other
found
rattling
another one.
the newspaper at his
So yeah,
bald
you can
head.
kind of hear
Here, this fellow that calls
that
himself
distortion.
the Misfit is aloof from the federal pen and headed towards Florida. And you...
Great. So we'll take us back to the beginning so we have a little bit more to work with. And let's go to our third point. And once again, we're going to be adjusting the width. And this is certainly something that
The
will
grandmother
take practice.
didn't want to go to Florida. She
Alright,
wanted
it's
to
certainly,
visit some of her connections in East Tennessee.
About training your ear to even
was seizing
recognize
every
what is
chance
wrong
to
with an
change
audio
Bailey's
track,
mind.
let alone how to fix it.
Bailey
So,
was the son she lived with.
Yeah, give yourself
her
the
only
space
boy.
to practice and learn.
He was sitting on the edge of his
So we're gonna
chair
go
at
ahead
the
and,
table,
drop
bent
down.
over
And
the
now you can probably
orange
start to
sports
hear
section of the journal.
a difference. We'll toggle this on and off.
Now look here, Bailey, she said. See here, read this. And she stood with one hand on her hip and the other rattling the
can
newspaper
hear
at
it.
his bald head.
But we're certainly not
Here,
done,
this
so
fellow that
let's
calls
not get ahead of
himself
ourselves.
the
We're
Misfit
far
is
from
aloof the federal pen
in a
and
good
headed towards
place.
Florida.
So let's now move on to our fourth point, and we're going to once again adjust the width, and oh yeah, let me correct that. And let's drag our point back to the beginning. So again, we have more to work with, and let's start looking for more
The grandmother
distortion.
didn't want to go to Florida.
Oop.
She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee and was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son
Yeah,
she
that
lived
sounds
with.
pretty
her only boy.
distorted. So let's
He was sitting on the
Let's
edge of his
drop that
chair at
down.
the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal.
yeah,
Now look
you
here,
can
Bailey,
you
she
can certainly
said.
hear the difference
See here,
in that.
read this.
So now we're moving on to our final point. We only have 5 to work with, so you really want to use them well. Let's toggle this on and off.
The
though, so you can
grandmother
hear.
didn't want to go to Florida. She
Yeah.
wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee and was seizing at every chance to change.
We're definitely on the right track. So let's once again adjust that width. And play our track. And just
The grandmother
scrub along
didn't
the-
want to go to Florida.
the x-axis a bit.
She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee and was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind.
Ooh. Yeah,
Bailey was the
there it
son
is.
she lived with. Her only
Wonderful.
boy. He was sitting on the edge of his
So you can
chair
see
at
all of the
table,
points are kind of in that
orange
mid-range,
sports
and that's
section.
usually where the human voice
Now
is
look
at
here,
its
Bailey, she
strongest.
said. See here,
So
read this.
that makes perfect sense. It means we've placed our points well.
The
So we'll toggle that
grandmother
on and off.
didn't
You can
want to
hear
go
what
to
it's,
Florida.
what it's doing.
The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee and was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son.
As you can hear, it is still pretty far from fixed,
He was sitting on the
which
edge
is all
of
the
his
more reason
chair
to get it
as he
right
bent over the
when you're
orange
recording
sports
rather than relying on a post-process like this. But we are going to do a little bit more to it to try to get it in a good place. So we're going to use that denoiser, or the denoise rather, not the denoiser. We're going to drag that in and open that up, and you can kind of hear it. It's doing quite a bit, but again, we
The
don't want it
grandmother
to,
didn't want to go to Florida.
to ruin our
She wanted to visit some of
signal.
her connections in East
So we are going to want to
Tennessee
walk that back, but let's toggle it on and off.
and was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his
Yeah,
chair
it is
at
doing
the
a
table,
lot, but a
bent
little,
over the
maybe a little
orange
too
sports
much.
section
So
of the journal. Now
again,
look
we don't
here,
want to be
Bailey, she
heavy-handed
said.
with
See
the.
here, read this. And
the
she stood with
denoise.
one hand on her hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit.
Okay.
is
I think that
loose
is
from federal
that's a
pen
fine
headed
place
towards
to
Florida. And
to
you
let
read
that
here what
rest.
he says.
And you can definitely hear that the reverb is more prevalent in the higher volume pieces, the parts where I'm speaking a little louder. And that's just because louder voice means more amplitude to bounce off of walls. So that's what. Oh, okay. So the last thing we're going to do is actually add a filter called Deverb. It's a de-reverberation filter, but I wanted to get us in a pretty good place before I just threw it on there. So
The
let's go ahead and
grandmother didn't
open that up
want
and
to
listen
go to
to it.
Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee
You can hear it's
and was seizing
you
at
go
every
way
chance
high
to
with
change
it.
Bailey's mind.
You start to really degrade.
Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy.
So we're
He
definitely
was
going to want
sitting
to
on
be
the
a
edge of
little
his
bit
chair
more
at the table,
lighter
bent over
touch.
the orange sports section of the journal.
Toggle
Now
these
look
on
here,
and off.
Bailey, she said. See here, read this. And she stood with one hand on her hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit.
So that is about as close as we are going to get it, and it's not terrible for sure. If we had a little bit more time, we can mess around in the parametric equalizer and try to fine tune some things, but I think that's definitely a good start. So thanks.